All right. We're here with Stephen Dunn and Selah Saterstrom. Thank you both for being here. My name is Roger Green. I'm the general editor of the New Polis, and we are going to jump into some questions that I had in this new series where I'm kind of interviewing authors whose work I find both compelling, but authors hopefully who know each other's work a little bit, and asking them some questions with vitamins in them. So for my first question for both of you is that in both of you write novels, and I wanted to ask to what extent you actively engage with the genre of the novel. And as you engage with the form, are you actively or consciously in discussion with, I have it in quotes here, but tradition or the history of the novel itself?
Um, well, I can maybe get the conversation started with just a couple of off-the-cuff thoughts. I mean, I think that writing in the form of the novel is going to always put me in conversation with the history of that genre, and that can be conscious or unconscious. Um, but to say that it's not, to say that it doesn't have that context takes it away from complexity and the opportunity to radicalize the conversation and move it forward. So I think that working in that form is always in conversation with that form's very complicated history. Having said that, when I'm working, I rarely think about like, oh, I'm in conversation with the history of this form of the novel. Um, for me, it's about first centering, privileging, and listening to the visitation that is the work and making choices on its behalf, including formal choices. Um, and so that kind of is the dynamic that I feel like primarily engaged with. But of course, that dynamic is always in conversation, you know, with the form and its complexities. So.
Yeah, same for me too. I'm not a well for like my own history with the novel. I didn't read a lot as like middle school, high school, and all of that stuff. But I started reading again and realized like I'm tired of novels, and that's only because I knew what one thing was, like what a novel was. And then I actually read Selah's Pink Institution, and it was called a novel. And I was like, oh, I like novels again. So that like me writing and reading there helped me out. So what I was so happy that that was called a novel that it like gave me permission to write what I wanted. And I realized it was like the length of it. And then I think having a class with Selah was saying that novel means new, and like discussions on a novel. So I think it's a term that can hold all of these different things. So that's why, I am in conversation with it in a way because I am writing it, but knowing that I think that this term novel can hold a lot of different things inside of it.
Yeah. So knowing each other's work, do you have either of you have a sense of what you think the other one is doing in their work in terms of the novel? Like,
Well, I mean, I'm such a fan and a student of Stephen's work and revisit it often. And, it's a, a novel has the possibility of being a revelation that continually unfolds and reveals and discloses new options and is a space of emergent strategies. And so, in that sense, I think that from my experience of Stephen's work, and a lot of work that I love, is that the work continues to deepen and evolve the paradigm. That is the novel, I guess.
So both of you tend to, compose to the page. That seems something that comes across, and at least in a really persistent way. I think more so with Potted Meat for Stephen's book, that Potted Meat does seem to work in a kind of linear fashion, up to the character kind of finishing school, going off into the military. But I wouldn't say that plot is necessarily the main sort of thing that holds either of your works together. It's not that, if you took like an elements of fiction class and you did like, I don't know, plot setting, characterization, theme and perspective or something like that, like plot would probably be lower if you had to rank them 1 to 5. From my reading, I didn't know. So it seems, and that's really different to me than some other writers out there right now. And so I'll talk about them maybe in another question. But there is, I think that there's a sensibility to you too as a writer, and an aesthetics of how, like some people might not, they might have to think like, how is this a novel? Like for
yeah, that question comes up a lot. And just like going back to Selah's work, and I say this all the time, so I feel bad about saying it again, but it's important to me. What I learned from reading Selah's works and things like it is that, like, plot being a space. So thinking of like the novel and a plot as a space, like a burial plot, a garden plot. So it's like what has to be done in this in this book. So that's kind of like the extent that I'm thinking of plot in a way. I'm sure there are some elements of like how people usually think about plot that comes in there, but I'm not necessarily like prioritizing those things.
Yeah.
I love what Stephen just said. I mean, like Stephen, I can appreciate that there's, books about what plot is, etc. But I like my first identification with plot is always connected to funerary rites, the place of the grave, the underworld. And so I think of plot in relation to the underworld, and the underworld for me is a zone of being initiated into the holy darkness. And so therefore, when we're talking about something like plot, it's a very contemporary trend to standardize this idea of plot in terms of narrative. And what uncertainty teaches us again and again is that plot is a zone that is actually profoundly unfixed. And so, this idea that plot has to be a certain way, or the plot has maybe been valued in mainstream publishing. It's like, I'm like, okay, that's cool. And I'm also like, what is that reifying? Because, I think what narrative teaches us is about how to be with uncertainty. It's not about regulating uncertainty. And sometimes conservative or traditional conversations about plot, I feel like, forget that uncertainty is the heart of plot.
I think the darkness and on that theme, that might be a good moment to move to the next question, which is the question of tragedy. And this is just something that I'm thinking about very much when I'm reading both of your work and outside of your work. So this is something I'm pondering in general. If people have read other things that I've been writing on the New Polis, the stuff on Peter Pan and Dionysus and sacrifice, or the stuff last year. I did a series on Adorno and Horkheimer, and their book, about questioning what Enlightenment is and where it comes from, and how fascism and stuff comes out of the Enlightenment. So there's a broader discussion to be had about this, but if I think about tragedy itself, and the word kind of means the goat song, broadly speaking, in literary history, in like an intro, like to literature class, you have classic tragedy, which is kind of the nobly born or the high-born hero, the king, the Oedipus type of person. Um, uh, uh, that figure is replaced in modernity with the so-called common person, and it could be like the Pamela, the big novels of the 19th century. It could be Jane Eyre, who's sitting behind me on the shelf right now, and so. The novel becomes, for me, like a place that provides space for tragedy, or that tragedy occupies. I don't know how I want to put that. Tragic conditions in your work, both of your works, tragic conditions surround the characters in your novels, and one might say they engage even with coming of age themes. Yet, at least in my reading of your work, there's also a kind of materiality to the conditions and a starkness to the language that defies traditions derived from the Bildungsroman, or the experience, that kind of 19th century experience novel. So I wondered just if you guys could talk about, I don't know that you probably consciously think like I'm writing a tragedy or something, but at least the way that tragic conditions show up. And if we talk about Selah's most recent book, the disaster is a major part of what's happening in the book, right? Seemingly something like a hurricane, but probably more abstractly just the disaster. And in Potted Meat, the title itself, right? Like the way that Potted Meat shows up throughout the course of the book, there's like a materialization of this kinds of these mixings of very different types of starkly contrasted materials throughout. Lots of visions of this. I'm thinking about the dog in the basement and cleaning up the dog shit. So, okay, Zoom's giving me some sort of thing. I'm thinking about, there's almost a kind of fabulism in Stephen's work. There's sometimes that it reads like a folk story, or like almost like a Cinderella story, like doing the chore of the coal, and having the coal fire burn out, and like up through like the entire novel, this character is like, the stepfather is just like, do this work, right? So it adds an element of materiality, and not to say that there aren't dreams of ninjas and things going on, but so maybe we'll start there. How do you engage, or to what extent do you engage with tragedy in your writing?
I think, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the materials too, because I feel like, I don't know, maybe like growing up in poverty, like that's what you have are your material conditions, your materials, and like the emotional quality those things have. I really wanted to have all of those things in there for whatever they said. And sometimes like those things carry more complex reasons that I may be able to name as a child or as an adult, but having these objects like in their context says something else. So yeah, just thinking about like if something is a small can of food, right? small can of potted meat, like how important that thing is. Like it maybe fed 5 kids for one summer lunch if you stretch it with mayo or something, right? So there's these other bigger conditions that you can't name while you're in the mess living in this. And sometimes these objects have joy attached to them, and they have, yeah, I don't know. So it's just like getting these things that say a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I forget what the book is called. I don't know, vibrational matter. So it's about like how material has an emotional quality.
Yeah, that's a vibrant matter, maybe.
Vibrant matter, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, when I first was thinking of that question, I was thinking of Tilly Olson's story of um, measuring out her lines um, enough that she could memorize them while doing domestic duties. And I think that materiality absolutely it yeah is part of the production of writing, and which doesn't mean, I also want to say I hold the vision for a coming of age story that is rooted in poverty, that is written in lusciousness rather than a spare um in a spare narrative style. I think it's really, again, I would go back to every story, every visitation has its unique request in order to become. And so, but all of which is to say is, the material reality connection to writing is absolute. And writing is also labor. And for a lot of us, writing is connected to education, which was a way out of poverty, which is a very, becomes a very, very complicated uh, experience.
Mm. And at least again, and this is in my reading of your work. Partly what I mean is of course the materiality of language itself, where there isn't necessarily a lot of like metaphor or overt symbology going on. Like remember like when I was like in high school, like I really liked Catcher in the Rye, and I still like J.D. Salinger. I watched the recent documentary. Um, uh, but like where you like learn like that the ducks flying away symbolizes some sort of lost innocence or something, or like in The Great Gatsby when you're in like like first year college classes, it's like, oh, the gray eyes looking over the dusk of the wasteland, and it's after World War I. Like that kind of thing doesn't seem to be what's exactly happening in your works. Rather, like, so if I take Selah's book as an example, writing itself shows up as a theme. So writing shows up as recipes throughout Slab, and you're having the Tiger, the main character, is having this discussion with Barbara Walters, which is sort of seems like it's like this sort of fantasy thing going on in her head. But what are they fantasizing about is like, well, these recipes. And then there's a recipe for the red velvet classic, right? But then there's the discussion of if if a bride were to serve red velvet classic at her wedding, it would be a slutty thing to do.
True story.
And so there's always a bringing, and that there's this turn towards that material condition, and then of course the turn, like, and here's a recipe that every Southerner knows, and the recipe then are the lyrics to When the Saints Go Marching In, right?
Just like a quick response to that, it's interesting you mentioned Catcher in the Rye and The Great Gatsby. Those were two books I didn't read until I was an adult,
Yeah.
because of my public school, for the most part, education in rural Mississippi and being in and out of the system. I read those in graduate school.
Mm.
But what I did read a lot of was the Bible, and I heard a lot of the Bible, and so, language for me, Eucharistia, speak of materialism. Are y'all there?
Yeah, it cut out for a second.
Are you there?
Are you there?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, great.
Okay, so but it cut out. You said language for me is, and then
perfect. We'll just leave it there. Just kidding. Well, so language for me has always been kind of, I would call it like Eucharistic adjacent. It's like, the word that became flesh. It's in the mouth. It's in house. It's embodied. And so thinking of materiality and language, it's always felt very, very embodied. It's felt like an animating principle. So I don't know if that speaks to what you were talking about, Roger, but anyway.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have a question about sacrifice in a minute, but maybe, I don't know, Stephen had thoughts on.
Yeah, I think for this, like for me too, like in school sometime, like what's the symbology of this thing? I forgot what we read in high school, but I don't know. But it didn't feel close to my life experience or neighborhood. And I'm not saying you can learn things outside of those things, but I rarely read things from Black people or like Black communities growing up for some reason, although we lived in like a Black town for the most part. And like I wanted the language to be close as possible, as I could to the way like we talk and the stories we tell each other and kind of what we valued as a community, but also like some of my personal things that I value too as an individual. Like that's why I wrote the ninja story, because I'm fond of it, but we all told it story growing up. Like, remember we had the ninja, that was like a thing, so it became its own symbol. Yeah, so it was like became its own symbol in our town. So I wanted like whatever we had, the language, the symbolism for the language to be its own thing, like as close as possible to our town and our language. And usually like in a lot of books, like Black speech is relegated to dialogue. Like it's not trusted to tell the story, like, I don't know if it's I don't know what the perception of it is, but for some reason, a lot of Black speech does not do the work of narration in books. It's relegated to dialogue, which dialogue is fine too. So that was another thing I wanted to do with language, was like pull that outside of dialogue to narrate and do whatever the job of narration is.
Yeah, and this ends up a stylistic choice. Both of you don't use quotation marks, for example. Right?
Yeah.
Dialogue. I thought Selah brought up the Bible, and I'm thinking about that church scene in Potted Meat, and the way memory is working, memorizing these passages from Matthew, I believe, and then that turn. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Towards this other kind of materiality, towards having memorized this Bone Thugs and Harmony song, that so it's doing the material thing, but it's also doing a community thing. I feel like that there are two aspects to African American community life that are being shown in that.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. Like the Bible, like we down with the Bible, and we're also down with Bone Thugs and Harmony as a community too. So it's both of those things are like equally important in those moments, amongst peers and with community people we respect. So yeah.
And of course, Lamentations and Slab in some ways is a meditation on Lamentations from the Bible.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. And prior to, all around and throughout writing that book, I was translating Lamentations, and very slowly and terribly. It was more of a being with and a reading than a legible translation. But I'm very interested in the way lamentation transmutes into celebration.
We've talked about that before with the second line, how like that's so important to both of us.
Yeah.
Like celebration and lamenting at the same time. It's
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I feel like that holds it all, you know, because my grandma was from Louisiana, so I grew up with that type of lamenting and celebrating as a way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
The Mardi Gras type of
Yeah.
vibe.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. I want to push us a little bit further here down this rabbit hole of sacrifice and that element with tragedy, and something Selah said a few minutes ago when you were talking about the materiality of language or the word made flesh. There's a great book on sacrifice by Guy Strumse, called The End of Sacrifice, where he really he's talking about the fall of the temple, the second temple in Jerusalem, and the diaspora, that this is what creates, because there's no concept of scripture, right? But you start getting these formations of things, and the Torah is something that you literally open up, right? And it's kept in a cupboard. And when what becomes rabbinic Judaism afterwards, where there's an opening up, and the text is kind of like the guts, the interior of what would have been, in ancient times, a sort of sacrificial animal. It's a really beautiful book. And so there is that. I asked that question about tragedy, but I'm thinking about sacrifice, and for people who don't know this might sound very, very weird, but for example, in religious studies, there's a scholarly discourse that does not think of Jesus as being sacrificed. So Jesus was executed, like George Floyd was executed. That was not a sacrifice. And later on, as the communal entity that comes to distinguish itself as Christianity, and the writings that get associated, then there's this sort of like narrative situation that gets kind of cast back onto this guy who got executed by the Romans. And so there is like, something about what we do with sacrifice that has to do with narrative at a very core level, I think, that I'm interested in both of your works. And this goes back to a Roman law and a lecture that my colleague Cleo Cairns gave last week in another kind of online format called Insight Seminars. So if you're watching this, check out Insight Seminar. And I hope I don't see Stephen there, but hopefully he comes back. The Insight Seminars, there's one on sacrifice, and so some of this stuff just look out for Cleo Cairns, if Kearns, if you're watching this and you want to see. So in some of the things that the elements of sacrifice for Cleo, she says it's a formal act of setting apart, of relinquishing and destroying something of worth, with the intention to open communication with the spirits. And another, so that's a kind of packed definition. I'm not going to read off all of the things the elements, but there are a couple that I think are really interesting when we think about our current social situation in the US. One is that in Roman times, at least, slaves cannot sacrifice. The reason why slaves cannot sacrifice is because everything about the sacrificial act must be willing. It must be something that, now whether or not that is actually what happens in a situation like, I don't know, in ancient times, or if you ask the cow, like, or ask the bull, do you agree to this? And the bull's like, "Well," I don't know that happens. But the idea, at least in the theory of sacrifice, is that it must, the so-called victim must be willing to go. And if you're in any kind of an enslaved situation, you would not be able to do that because your will is not necessarily your own. So I think about this a lot lately because of the movement for Black Lives, for example. I think about it a lot in Water and Power, Stephen, in your second book, and this choice for the character to go into the Navy. And what does it mean? Thank you for your sacrifice is a kind of theme that shows up constantly in that book, and in the various different perspectives that are presented in that novel. And then we have this character of preacher, and we have an active engagement with hoodoo culture going on in Slab, and all that being intermeshed with other forms of writing, like the metaphysical postcard game, for example, with tarot cards themselves. So, yeah, I just wonder what you guys think about sacrifice in your work, in each other's work, or and I just talked a lot, but if any of that sparks things in your brain holes.
Your questions are making me rethink, or what you put in the email about sacrifice and what you just said. I've been negative towards it, so I'm reworking that, my own feelings around sacrifice, but just from like being in the conditions, growing up in poverty, and like what gets sacrificed, light bill or heat bill, right? Like I remember my mom, like with food stamps, we would have to drive to a gas station and buy like a 5-cent piece of gum, just to get enough money for gas, right? To get the change from a $1 food stamps. And that's a sacrifice, but not necessarily a choice, I feel. So sacrifice has been something negative to me, or what kind of people in power, like you say, casts back the idea of sacrifice, like in the military, like, oh, you've been sacrificed. So yeah, I've had negative issues with the word sacrifice or the idea. So thank you for like giving me those new things to think about. So I haven't intentionally thought about sacrifice, but I've thought about those conditions in which get called sacrifice, and I write about them to kind of, I don't know, to stretch them out and see them for what they are in those specific contexts of like the military and poverty, and Blackness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear Stephen's kind of initial reaction to sacrifice as negative, because I had kind of a similar, a similar kind of response. And it's just interesting thinking out loud here. One of the things I will never forget about Katrina is on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, which was really leveled at that point. And before FEMA was there, the military was there recruiting. And so the first water that came in to my mother's community of Waveland, Mississippi, they were, it had been days, was from a 18-wheeler that Oprah Winfrey sent down. And yet they were already, there was already ready to go rhetoric around recruiting for the military. And anyway, I just, when Stephen was talking, and I had that recollection. And, and I think the thing about sacrifice, just examining my own reaction to it is, the sacrifices that are made, for example, when one is in an impoverished situation, the differences between thriving and surviving. And any system that requires an individual to ally with dynamics or belief systems that require that individual to diminish themselves or dim their light, is rooted in poverty consciousness and a lack paradigm. And I think a lot of people, associate sacrifice with that kind of lack paradigm, understandably, and it's like you get to a place where you don't want to just survive, but you want to thrive. You don't you and so if there is a system by which sacrifice is operating where everyone is a willing participant, I mean, I think that there are probably examples of that. I think they are few and far between, and I'm suspicious of them. Because in my own experience, most systems that require a person to relinquish any access to liberatory options rarely, I don't know. It's just a complicated, I'm going down a rabbit hole, the rabbit hole of sacrifice, to use your phrase, Roger. But yeah, I don't know. It's tricky. I think sacrifice is one of these ideas that we can talk about it in this religious sense of something set aside. But to go back to your earlier point about the material reality of the lives of human beings, ideas of sacrifice are complicated.
Yeah.
Sorry, I feel like that was very rambling.
No, that's
long-winded, and anyway, I'm not good at Zoom, but
yeah. This is I talk frequently with Tink Tinker, who's written some articles for the website, and Tink and I have developed this language around the term Euro-Christianity, which is a term that we use to talk about whiteness in a way, what people call whiteness, while acknowledging that whiteness is this kind of historical construct that's rooted especially in like pseudoscience of the 19th century. So you got to talk about whiteness, but we also want to talk about it in its broader sort of white supremacy and what happens, how that is embedded with this phenomenon called Euro-Christianity, which we do not call a religion, because religion is kind of Christianity's terms to say, like, you're this religion, you're this religion, you're this religion, and we're the real religion. So we use as a descriptor for a social movement rather than a religion. But Tink is an Osage man, and he's particularly sensitive to the ways that people talked about, or colonizers talked about, Native people not having religion. All of the first accounts are that they don't have religion. But then later on, there's this kind of forms of Indian religion that are somehow less evolved. And then they want to talk about things like human sacrifice with Aztec people, for example, which we get very one-sided stories about whatever is happening there. But it gets thrown into this sacrifice construct of the concept of something set aside. And he's just, at least for Tink, he's like, Native people don't do that. We don't set things aside. It is not separated out. We don't have religion. But now we have these kind of scholars coming back and telling us what Native American religion is. So this is just an ongoing, how do we talk about whatever practices are that people have without using some sort of like concept of religion? Or to take another example, a couple of weeks ago on NPR, somebody sent me on Facebook, NPR did a story about white supremacy in Christian churches in the US. And it was like, took two churches, and one was a Black church and one was a white church in town. That's how it has. And the African American people who had left one church and started another church, and how much they don't talk to each other, and they're on, just down the street from one another. And so what the idea of an entity like the church might mean, for me, whatever, I mean, I can't know, right? Because I'm an outsider, but whatever it might be, like uh, uh, whatever the so-called black church might be when people use that terminology, or when we talk about James Cone and or black liberation theology, that whole sort of whatever that phenomenon is, and what the role that that is going on in African American religious context is not the same thing as the Euro-Christian context. So I'm not just sort of calling out Christianity necessarily. Neither would be Coptic Christianity in Egypt, for example. That's not Euro-Christianity. But I feel like there's a poetics of sacrifice to the Euro-Christian sort of matrix that asks people, or that, well, doesn't really ask, but pretends to ask, maybe in the Army or Navy recruitment situation. It's an ask, or it's like you're supposed to volunteer, but we know that there's something deeper than that. So then it makes you think whether or not like this thing that people call religion is something that only like the kind of priestly class can do. And that lamentations or like Malachi in the Old Testament, it's like like the people are being punished because they're not giving their best animals for the sacrifice, right? That's one of the problems that makes the desert god mad at them. uh, um, I've kind of rambled a little bit on there, but uh, I feel like that, you know, Jacques Derrida has a whole sort of, you know, famous essay on the pharmacon and the substitution and post-structural theory does a lot with that kind of substitution stuff. But I in some ways, I feel like with work like writers like yourselves, that's why I keep coming back to this materiality of the text. And yes, language is all about substitution at one level, but like this is not a Greek tragedy. These are not Greek tragedies. Like whatever the work, the tragic is being done, and yes, I think you're dealing with characters in very impoverished environments, but that blending, like you said, of the celebratory and the tragic is, I want to say that's something that I feel like is unique. Something, you know, if there's yeah, if we were talking about novels, like if I care, maybe in a minute I'll compare it to somebody like Elizabeth Strout. But I just talked for a few minutes. I don't know if things resonated or didn't resonate.
Well, I definitely, and you know, I mean, I think that you know, it's interesting. Something that I've been thinking about a lot is this place, this idea, but this place of the charnel grounds. And I feel like we're really in it. I feel like we're always in it, and I feel like it's always like kicking up flares and so forth. And it's a place it's a place that is beyond binaries. It's not the good or the bad. It's the good and the bad. It's the spectrum. It's a place of flux where the pain and suffering of our interconnectivity is revealed alongside the void through which maybe strategies will emerge that can, by which we can attune to that paradox in a way that doesn't kill the entire planet, right? So I guess, you know, just all of which, not to go off on a tangent, but you know, this idea of tragedy, lamentation and celebration is in everything simultaneously. And I think one of the things that wants to come through the sieve of all of us more than ever before is multivalence. Multiple modes, multiple intelligences, multivalence. And so I think multivalence, and I think tragedy is stitched into every moment. And also its opposite and what is beyond its opposite.
Mm.
I don't know. I don't know if that in any way connects into this conversation in a meaningful way, but I mean, I think that this idea of tragedy and setting things apart and thinking back, Roger, to what you were saying about Tink, that we don't set things apart. Like, I mean, I think there's something to that. This idea of skillful will, which is using everything, working with everything to create the most poignant result inside of a tremendous uncertainty.
Mm.
Like I said, I'm not sure if that if that even makes sense, but
Yeah, but it sounds like at least on some level, you're thinking about this stuff in relation to your work, that there's some sort of active thing. So I'm thinking about, I'm trying to think of examples, and there's a kind of intergenerational thing going on in throughout Slab. I mean, ostensibly, I mean, the book is really complex on so many different levels because it sets itself up talking about itself as a stage or stage productions. It deals with film and movies. So there are different kinds of stages without, it is on a concrete slab, right? The context of Tiger being on the slab. But then what we get, immediately, like, was it like 40 miles away, preacher is walking on a beach somewhere. And so these things that you could do if you had a film camera, maybe, and you could cut things together, but you could never do that on stage. So like what is happening in the book is undermining the idea of perspective itself that way. And then as we get towards this engagement with tarot cards and futures and pasts, time and temporality is being really, I don't know, stretched or played with.
yeah, I think that's just about this desire to bring a multivalence through, in a way.
And that the stage is, I mean, the slab is flexible, right? Like so much happens
Yeah,
on a slab, and it shifts and it becomes anything, which
yeah.
like it seems like a rooted thing, right? A slab, like the word itself is hard, but the actual workings of the book is that it becomes everything.
I'm struck by there are elements of sacrifice, especially like I said, in water and power, Stephen. But my mind right now is going to the relationship between the main character and his sister in the book, and the sister has a dead twin, and the dead twin materializes in this visit to a set, and at least for me, like, when ghosts are appearing in these types of contexts, it's like I have to think of Beloved, I have to think of Toni Morrison, and what does it mean to have like another half of a self that's left, or a daughter that's left that grows but comes back. That's not what happens with this little girl, but it's this moment of, I guess, surreality, or this break of something transcendent in an otherwise highly materialistically focused text. I wonder get thoughts or wanted to talk about that scene.
Yeah, yeah, what you said, like those moments for me too. And just thinking of like the character or like with a dead sister and like how much also ghosts are always around. So like often visiting death and talking about dead people. Like growing up, my grandmother like would always see the ghost in the house. There was always somebody, it was her husband or child, like there was always ghosts in our house, you know. And then with, say, my sister growing up too, like there's always this talk of her twin, you know. So it's, my sister was pretty sensitive, I think, you know. Yeah, no, she was like pretty sensitive. So it's like either like this sense that my sister is both people now, you know, in a way, like she is two people because her twin is not there and all of those things. So just having these moments in life, you know, like wanted that space to be in the book too. Like everything is very like grounded and dirty, you know, and real and everything. But there are these like other like lighter things, you know, like stuff that comes and goes, ephemeral things.
Yeah. So at least in the way that you're talking about this, and I know Selah and I have talked about this a lot, especially with Meat and Spirit Plan, Selah, like uh, it seems like in our conversation, you're kind of like owning the characters as part of your actual life experience, like an actual sister. You were using like my sister, and it's like she has a double. Um, and so what that does with that distinction between author and character, um, and this is not like Kiese Lehmann's book heavy, right? Which is, it sets itself up as a metaphor, or sorry, as a memoir. Um, uh, Yours is framed as a novel. I mean, it says that it's a novel. So I'm wondering how you think about that in terms of characterization and autobiography. Are there breaks in that for you? Does it not really matter?
Oh man, I've been slipping a lot lately. I think at first I was trying. Yeah, even when I first answered this question, like the character, blah blah blah. I've been slipping a lot lately, and I'm just like, you know what, you know, like I wrote it. A lot of it's based off my experiences and stuff. Like I have a sister, you know, but that's still like not the sister in the book, you know, which is different. Also, like yeah, I have a sister who, you know, had a twin and she died, but the book is still something different. So it's like my relationship with that is for the book. Yeah. So yeah, it's funny. I can't remain professional. I don't know what it's called, professional or not, but I'll try to like the narrator for the character of this book, sister, and I can't do it for some reason. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And people have often confused you, Selah, to an annoying extent, at least from our conversations.
Yeah.
Assume that you are these people, and that you have a tiger suit that you wear around the house.
Which I also do. That's the problem, right? Or that's the complexity. I mean, I can recall being on a panel in the last 5 years with three other men on the panel, and they were all asked about their characters, and the one question I received was about me, as if it was really a question about a character in my book, but it was framed directly as if it was personal. And there's a long history of that happening with female identified authors. And I think that I would never feel, it wouldn't be energetically accurate to call the novels nonfiction,
Right.
because there's an alchemical process in the space of those projects, becoming books, that I'm collaborating with something that animates my personal material beyond even its own boundaries. And so it wouldn't be accurate to call it memoir. And yet, there are real flesh pieces of me in my books, for sure. like, back to your kind of opening question in a way about the novel. It's like what Stephen had said then, the novel can hold so many gestures, and it can hold contradiction, it can hold dissonance, it can hold parabolic narrative dynamics. But yeah, I have often been mistaken for characters in my books, and it's like I understand that, and it's also like more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But where it becomes problematic is when that error becomes a kind of mode of judgment that has professional real life consequences.
Yeah. Well, see, that's where I want to. Yeah, I'm wondering. So I'm wondering if that voice. I don't even want to use the term hybrid between like autobiography and novel there, but the paradoxes of what you have both just talked about, like that seems to be that something that's going on in your work that is not going on in someone like Elizabeth Strout's work. Like my name is Lucy Barton, and so where this is coming, I'm not meaning too much to pick on Elizabeth Strout, but I got asked last year to review a book, like a peer review situation, on American fiction post the 2008 housing crash. And so it was very much about kind of material conditions, and it was by an Eastern Europe. I'm not going to name the place, but it was by a scholar working in an Eastern European context. And the scholarship, the economic scholarship in this book was just excellent. It was amazing. And so I don't want to be saying, like, if I'm saying critical things about people's work, I want to give some due praise. But one of the things that I found missing myself, being somebody who works and lives here in the US and, engages in actual writing communities producing literature, is that the material conditions in which we are writing are very much contextualized by the national discussions that are happening right now around the movement for Black lives, most recently. But they took down Columbus statues in Columbus, Ohio. The Redskins finally gave up their racist name this week, right? So there's those contexts, and then there's what we call in the education community and higher education, like inclusive excellence, where we have like a spectrum of race, gender, ethnicity, gender expressivity, sexual orientation, nationality, age, ability, disability, this whole list of categories, right, that we have that we're supposed to attend to as teachers working in a situation, but that weirdly, those categories also seem to be showing up as the social drive in National Book Awards, in the kind of broader literary landscape. So for me, for example, for me,
you got
yeah. Yeah, for me, in that broader national context, when I read a book like Elizabeth Strout's My Name is Lucy Barton, it comes across as which is very much about white poverty in Appalachia, and dealing with the context of the book, if you haven't read it, is kind of this woman who gets sick, and her mom from Appalachia comes to New York City to visit her, and this character has a job where she's always looking out at the Chrysler building, right? So there's these symbols, like that's that hard symbol thing, the Catcher in the Rye symbol. It's like, oh, okay, so you're looking at capital, you're looking at that's definitely going on. And the book is very plot structured, it's very centered, but it also feels to me, and maybe I'm just critical right now about this, that this, in the broader context, it's kind of like this, like, well, like there are poor white people too, which already just kind of in a fucked up way just assumes that like African American people are all poor, for example, right? Because it's already done this kind of thought work, or that, like, you know, minimize my family didn't own slaves. My students, one of my students read last week. They read uh, Letter from a Region Inside My Mind by James Baldwin, and you know, a young man said that James Baldwin is reverse racist, and so I had to deal with the illogic of assuming that people are on a kind of platform where you could just reverse one thing from the other, right? That ignores history and asymmetry of power relationships. So that's a little bit of I'm trying to kind of contextualize for a wider audience. It seems to be driving literary production in the industry. It seems to me that mainstream books that are very sort of maybe more plot driven are getting, you know, it, I can't remember the press. It's a big press that, uh, um, or a bigger press that Lucy Barton's on. And I'm wondering if there's a power differential between writers like yourselves who are having that kind of paradoxed voice context where it's blending the autobiographical and the fabulous or the fictional. Is that what keeps you guys outside of the mainstream? I mean, it doesn't keep Claudia Rankine out of the mainstream to do Citizen, but maybe that's a different. Citizen's not a novel, too.
Yeah. Yes. No. I think. Well, like my agent has tried to sell my books to mainstream, and if the creative people of the big press say okay, then it gets sent to the financial people or the marketing department, and a lot of the times that's where the no's usually come from. So it's usually an issue that like our readers won't recognize this as a novel, or there's enough character development in the third part of the book and the character grows up too fast, and some of it's insulting because like, wow, we do grow up fast because of some things, you know, and I wrote that. So yeah, I think it's the issue of what Selah said about like not about regulating uncertainty or whatever, like plot regulating uncertainty. So yeah, all of those things kind of like keep me out of the mainstream. And length of a book, a novel has to be whatever 70,000 words, so it's not a novel and can't be sold as one as on a bigger press. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, what a big discussion. And I want to be mindful of our time. Oh my goodness, I have a lot of thoughts about it. And also very few thoughts in a way, which is, you know, I don't know about industry. I mean, I know in the sense that I see it happening, and I observe it, and sometimes I'm really feel sad about it. One of the narratives I've been looking at in terms of my identity as a writer is, you know, I think for a while I carried around a lot of shame that I wasn't, quote, more well known than I am. And I've recently really kind of realized, to kind of go back to a previous part of what our discussion, that to continue to live like that is to ally with the belief system that requires me to diminish myself by staying in a space where I'm reinscribing my shame. And the truth is every book I have written to the very best of my ability, even past slightly. you know, I have given my very best, and have not been very savvy to careerism and professionalism. And I think that, you know, so it's like, oh, I'm not a good caretaker of my kingdom because I don't know how to advocate for myself and sell myself as a brand.
Mm-hmm.
All of which is to say is I'm just really like saying fuck that.
Yeah.
And you know, and I do see that there is a tradition of people working in these kind of hybrid forms, which, like you know, Roger, I kind of reject that idea because language is a hybrid medium.
Mm.
And right, and every form is hybrid, but whatever. I
Yes.
understand it as a category. You know, I get it as a category. But you know, like we can look at the career of, say, Michael Ondaatje, right? His first two books. We can look at, you know, I think there's a number of people we can point to who are working in similar modes that have had quote mainstream success. And so I don't know, all of which is to say is like, I'm just trying to non-judgmentally observe and participate in this process of publishing without increasing my own shame.
Mm.
And it is a work in progress.
Mm.
Yes. Yes. It is very tough. And I'm kind of in a place now. It's like I just need to write what I need to write.
Yeah.
And maybe it'll be on the big press, but I'm not necessarily uh, like striving for that always. I mean, like money would be nice if people get money from that. I've heard they do. You know, I don't know, like that would be cool, but I don't. You know, like I have a job. You know, like I have a decent life outside of that. So yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it's not a goal. And I also don't want anybody on my books talking about it's a tour de force. Really, you know, that's kind of what happened. I'm just being funny, but you know,
Well, I think even, and I will wrap it up here. And so thank you so much for both of your time. So I think what I'm kind of getting at is even sort of beyond the success and non-success of the mainstream versus the marginalized. Arguably, I mean, like, like the conditions of literary production, one could read. I don't. I mean, one would. I think especially have to read potted meat, in terms of the ways that that African American identity is important to understand. It's important to understand that moment where, you know, the young white girl asks, what does the X on your hat stand for, right? Or, you know, um, asking the little girl from Africa who doesn't speak English yet, you know, what are things like in the motherland, right? So there's being forced to color with the crayon to color the white girl's skin brown, at home, right? Like so. What I'm sort of getting at in both of these books, and Preacher, as a character in Slab, I think that race is something that is important to the ways that these books are structured thematically, and gender, for example, or at least sexual orientation, especially in Water and Power, where we're talking about sexual assault, we're talking about um, don't ask, don't tell in the military. So what I'm saying is, I feel like these categories of identification are clearly at work in your both of your works, and those categories are at work in kind of mainstream literary production. But I wonder, is that just the product of being like what it means to be writing, and writing, taking in our culture in this moment and writing in the moment? Or is it more or less of an active thing for you in your writing lives? Or is it merely a reflection? Like when Laird Hunt writes Never Home, for example, which, like, I love Laird's writing, but it's this kind of gender bendy type of story that could talk about like a kind of transgender, or at least a very ambiguous kind of gender that the main character is going through, being a woman and going off to fight in the Civil War, and leaving the man at home, right, and passing as a man in that book. So it's all over the literary landscape, and I would say, I don't think that Laird Hunt is doing that in a contrived way. I think he's walking a line. He's maybe like playing with his skill as a writer to be able to write convincingly in that kind of a context. But so I only use Laird Hunt as an example that I think he has to be consciously doing something like that. So it's not necessarily bad to be conscious that one's doing that, or make your work contrived or something. I'm just wondering to what extent for you two as writers that becomes a part of the writing process itself.
Well, I mean, I think that, it's, the joke is, right, like writing gives you endless opportunities to practice non-attachment. And I think that's really true. I think that sometimes I want a character to see beyond what they can see. And that's an ego check moment where it's like, oh yeah, this writing is staged for my ego to have, to spin out. It's about rather being in service of this visitation that necessitates this type of telling, which may not align with what I had hoped for, or what I had even wanted, or what I thought the book was about, or the character was about. And so it's just trying to stay true and aligned to the visitation, which is the book. And if I let that guide me, it cuts out a lot of bullshit.
Any idea where the visitation comes from?
No, I mean, I've been writing about lately. I'm working on an essay, and I've been writing about Diderot, who's been a main character for me for many years, a thinker who I've been engaging with for many years. And he talks a lot about nothingness, and but etymologically speaking, if you follow the tendrils down and deep into the guts of nothingness, what you find is that rather than absence, there is an overwhelming presence. It's a plurality of intensities. And so yeah, this idea that Diderot suggests, wherever there is nothing, read that I love you, read animation, read engagement. And so I don't know, all of which is to say that's just something I've been thinking about in relation to some of the thoughts that you've been asking us about.
Great. Yeah, and for me, like writing in those themes or whatever it is, like it's old stuff, like it's a lot of old issues, things passed down, people I'm involved with. Like I ran into a problem with water and power where I did a reading at a school, and one of the students asked me how did I navigate being perceived as transphobic, and I was like, oh, I didn't know that, but I had to check myself, like maybe it is, and they were talking about the story where the guy is in Thailand and the lady boy, and I called it fiction, so it appears, or it's like basically like that is my imagination, since I called it fiction, but the story is from a friend of mine, so there's another issue with fiction and nonfiction, I guess. So I was like, man, if I would have called this book nonfiction and say, hey, this story is from a real person, and maybe I wouldn't, place the blame elsewhere. I don't know, but I had to deal with that, like check myself, like maybe this story is transphobic, and just listen to what people had to say. But me writing that is not like consciously, I mean, it's consciously like being aware of my friend's issues and like our lives and things he dealt with and what he wanted to share. So in a way, but it's still just like coming from something old and lived in a way that takes on another it takes on more like in the book context of the books, it takes on something else and goes maybe beyond what it is and beyond my experience and his experiences.
I think that we've talked a long time. I'm really, really grateful and thankful for you spending time with me and
Thanks.
engaging my questions.
My kid won't go to bed. I'm in here and he's I know he keeps coming back. So I'm gonna go tend to him.
Yeah.
Try to get him to go to bed. So thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll let you know when this is all posted, but thank you very much.
All right.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Good night.
All right.